My name is Vivienne. I've always considered myself a person who knows what she wants from life and knows how to achieve it. My friends call me decisive, self-confident, sometimes even a little strict. As an interior designer, I am used to order and harmony. Everything must be perfectly calibrated, every detail in its place, especially in a relationship. But one night, I woke up to the sound of his voice in the hallway. The phrase, "she knows nothing," echoed in my head. It was my husband, the man I trusted more than anything in the world. Imagine, the very woman who professionally creates ideal spaces suddenly discovers that her own flawless life was just a skillfully designed illusion. Want to know how a simple divorce turned into a multi-million-dollar battle, where not only finances but also my freedom were at stake? What secrets did my perfect husband of 12 years hide? And how did I manage to outwit the one who thought he could destroy me? Our channel is full of exciting stories, where each new story is a new turn of events, new emotions, and unexpected endings. Share in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal by those you completely trusted? Your experience can be an important lesson for others who are going through difficult times now. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell so you don't miss the next story. I was 40 years old. Our family seemed exemplary. We lived in a cozy suburb, in a house with large windows that let in light even in the most cloudy days. We had a spacious garden where I loved to have afternoon teas, and on weekends we often invited friends over for barbecues. Everything around us screamed about the perfect life. Impeccable furniture, carefully arranged flowers, photos of happy moments on the walls. Even the neighbors envied our perfect couple. Adrian and I were together for 12 years, an entire era if you think about it. We met at university, where he taught art history, and I was just starting out in design. A spark flew between us at first sight, and 2 years later we got married. I remember that day as if it were yesterday. A white dress, a light breeze, rustling autumn leaves in the park. Adrian then told me that our life would be like a work of art, every moment filled with meaning, beauty, depth. I believed him so much that I didn't notice how this picture began to crack at the edges, how thin webs of omissions and secrets began to creep away on our canvas before it was too late. But honestly, I have never been a woman who lives for relationships. My career has always been an important part of my life. I started with a small studio in the city center, where I worked on projects for cafes and friends' apartments. Over time, my reputation grew, and I became one of the most sought-after designers in the city. People knew me as a person who could turn an empty space into a work of art. However, despite my success, I always found time for my family, for Adrian, for us. We were a team. Or at least I thought so. There was always a balance in our relationship. Adrian was the one who could relieve the tension after a hard day, tell an interesting story, or just hug when words were not needed. He was an intellectual, a man with an open mind, and I always loved the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his research. We complemented each other. I am practical, he is a dreamer. I am organized, he is a free spirit. But now, looking back ago, I realize that it was this very difference between us that was the first rock that broke the delicate balance. His freedom gradually turned into detachment, and my organization turned into control. We both played our roles, but perhaps for too long, we pretended that everything was fine. On the surface, everything looked perfect. We were the couple that people invited to weddings to set an example of a successful relationship. We traveled, spent evenings chatting, enjoyed Sunday brunches, but inside there was always an uneasiness that I studiously ignored. Sometimes it was little things: his habit of turning off his phone during dinner, the strange calls late at night that he stopped as soon as I walked into the room. Sometimes it was more serious: his sudden reluctance to discuss our financial affairs, his detachment at moments when I most needed his support. And then, one day, that inner voice that had been trying to warn me for so long became louder, so loud that I could no longer ignore it. It started with little things, with those same small cracks in our picture of life, but the more I noticed, the clearer it became. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong. Now, as I write these lines, I understand that my story is not just a tale of betrayal. It is a story about how we create illusions, believe in them, and then learn to see the truth, no matter how painful it may be. This is the story of how I, Vivienne, stopped being the one who is afraid to admit the obvious and became the one who is ready to fight for her life. If someone asked me to describe our family life in words, I would probably choose the following: perfect, harmonious, happy. We were the people who were invited to holidays as an example of what a real relationship should look like. Our photos decorated social networks. Our stories were passed from mouth to mouth among friends and acquaintances. We were the ones, those who were envied, those who seemed to have found the key to eternal happiness. Every day began the same way: coffee in bed, light conversation about plans for the day, morning hugs that, as it seemed to me, charged us with energy for the whole day. Adrian always woke up before me, and I loved watching him through half-closed eyes, getting ready, carefully folding his clothes, checking his phone. He was so methodical, so calm. Sometimes I even envied his ability to remain calm when the world around us was seething with chaos. The day usually continued in a routine that, however, seemed pleasant to both of us. Adrian went to university, where he taught art history, and I went to my studio, where new projects and clients awaited me. We ate lunch separately, but almost always texted during the day. His messages were short, but warm. "How is your day going? Don't forget to have lunch. I'll be waiting at home." These little things seemed to me proof that we were still close, that our connection was strong despite our busy schedules. Evenings were special times. We met at home, where dinner was already waiting, cooked by me or ordered from a restaurant. We usually watched movies, discussed the news, or just talked about what was on each of our minds. Adrian loved to tell stories from his work, about students who inspired him, about new studies he read. I listened to him with pleasure because his passion for history always fascinated me. We complemented each other. He was the one who could captivate the conversation, and I was the one who could bring a practical side to it, offer a solution or a new idea. Weekends were our time. We often went out of town, walked in parks, visited exhibitions, or just spent time at home, enjoying the silence. Sometimes we threw parties for friends, and I was proud of how easily we managed to create an atmosphere of coziness and joy. Our guests always left with the feeling that they had visited a special place where love and harmony reigned. But behind all this shine and seeming perfection, there was a shadow that I refused to notice for a long time. Looking back, I realized that many of these perfect moments were just a mask for something more complex. For example, our dinners, which I considered a symbol of our closeness, sometimes turned into a formality. Adrian would stare at his phone for hours, answering messages I didn't see or talking about things that seemed superficial to me. I noticed how his gaze became distant when I tried to discuss something important, but I attributed it to fatigue, to the stress of work. I didn't want to admit that something had changed. This was especially evident in our financial matters. We always kept separate accounts, but jointly paid for major expenses: the mortgage, utilities, groceries. It seemed convenient to us because each of us had the opportunity to control our personal spending. But one day I noticed that Adrian began to show an unusual interest in my finances. He began asking questions that he hadn't paid attention to before. How much did you spend on the new project? Do you have any savings for emergencies? These questions sounded innocent, but there was a certain tension in them, as if he was trying to find out something specific. Our house also became a kind of symbol of this duality. From the outside, it looked perfect. White walls, a perfectly trimmed lawn, a cozy garden with a swing. But inside, I increasingly noticed small changes that had previously escaped my attention. For example, Adrian began to lock his office, although before the door was always open. He began to share his plans less often, preferring to speak general phrases instead of specifics. And although I tried not to attach importance to it, my inner voice increasingly whispered that something was wrong. Now that I know the truth, I understand that our perfect life was just a decoration, behind which a completely different reality was hidden. But then, in those days when I still believed in our fairy tale, I continued to play my role. I continued to believe that all this was real, that we are real. Our story began at university, where life was filled with youthful enthusiasm, romance, and the expectation of something more. I was just starting out in the world of interior design, while Adrian was already a young history teacher arts. We met at a faculty event, which I thought was just another formality. But meeting Adrian turned everything upside down. The first thing that attracted me to him was his ability to talk about art as if it were a living being. When he talked about the Renaissance, his eyes lit up and his voice acquired a special musicality. I remember the first time we talked after his lecture. I asked a question about the symbolism in Vermeer's paintings, and Adrian didn't just answer. He drew me into a whole discussion that lasted almost an hour. We discussed not only art, but also philosophy, literature, even politics. It was the beginning of something bigger. Our first dates were full of romance. We walked around the university park, sometimes dropped into small cafes where we discussed the latest books we had read. Adrian was always attentive. He remembered the little things I mentioned in passing and surprised me with small gifts that I thought showed his sincerity. He once brought me an old postcard of a Dutch painting, saying that it reminded him of our first conversation. Moments like these made me feel special. Over the 2 years we spent together, we became inseparable. I remember him proposing to me in the very park where we met. It was autumn, and the leaves were swirling around us, as if nature had created its own scenography for us. Adrian got down on one knee and said that he wanted to spend the rest of his life creating something beautiful with me, our own work of art. I said yes without hesitation, because at that moment I believed that our love was truly unique. The first years of our marriage were filled with joy and mutual respect. We helped each other grow professionally. Adrian gave me advice on art history, and I helped him design his presentations to students. We were a team that strived for success. But gradually, I began to notice that some things in our relationship were changing. Not all at once, but slowly, imperceptibly, like drops of water that break through a stone over time. The first warning sign was his increasing secrecy. If at first we shared everything, our dreams, fears, even small problems, then later Adrian began to talk less about his work. He claimed that it was due to fatigue or stress, but I felt that there was more to it. His phone, which used to be always in plain sight, began to disappear from the room when I entered. Sometimes I heard him talking on it in a low voice, But as soon as I got closer, he immediately cut off the conversation. These moments seemed small, almost insignificant to me, but their accumulation caused discomfort. Another change was his attitude to our finances. In the beginning, we never had long conversations about money. It was all simple and straightforward. But about 3 years ago, Adrian began to take an unusual interest in my income and spending. He asked where I was putting my money, why I wasn't investing more, and even once suggested that we combine our accounts. Although I agreed, it wasn't as easy a solution as I expected. Later, I discovered that he was checking our bank statements more often than he should have. Perhaps the most painful change was how Adrian began to distance himself emotionally. We spent less and less time together, and he began making excuses not to go to events or participate in our usual weekend rituals. His explanations always sounded logical: work, fatigue, the need to focus on a research paper. But I felt like they were just a mask for something bigger. One day, I asked him point blank, "What's going on? Why are you so distant?" He said nothing was going on, he was just a little tired. But his words sounded fake, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was lying. Looking back now, I realize that these changes were harbingers of a storm to come, but at the time, I didn't want to admit the obvious. I kept believing that these were temporary difficulties, that our love was stronger than any trials. I was wrong. When I think back to those days that seemed so perfect, I feel deeply disappointed. Everyone around us saw our life as a model of perfection, but in reality, it was just an artfully created illusion. We were the very same neighbors about whom people said how happy they are. We were the couple that people invited to weddings to show what real love looks like. But behind the closed doors of our home, something completely different was happening. One of the most obvious contrasts between our outward well-being and reality was our financial situation. On the surface, everything looked perfect. We owned a beautiful house, we had savings, and we could afford expensive restaurants and travel. But what I did notice was that Adrian was starting to show an unhealthy interest in my personal finances. He was asking about the amounts. Oh, the money I spent and the places I kept my savings. One day, I found him checking my bank statements, something he had never done before. It made me uneasy, but I chalked it up to him taking care of me. Now I realize it was the beginning of his plan. Another red flag was his constant absences. At first, they were short walks or, as he said, working on a new article. But then these absences became more frequent and longer. I found myself wondering if I could remember the last time we spent a full day together. One night, I woke up and heard him talking in the other room. His voice was quiet, but I caught the phrase, "She doesn't suspect a thing." It was a cold blow. My heart sank, and my mind began to frantically search for an explanation. Maybe it was just a work call. But then, why was he speaking so quietly? Adrian's emotional detachment was another clear sign that something was wrong. Whereas before, we could talk for hours about everything under the sun, now our conversations were limited to formal questions about our plans for the day or what we were buying at the supermarket. He smiled less often, and his eyes lost the sparkle I loved so much. One day, I asked him if everything was okay, and he replied, "I'm just tired." But his tone was so cold that I felt uneasy. I also began to notice strange changes in his behavior. For example, he often left his phone unattended, although before, he always kept it with him. One day, I saw a message from an unfamiliar name. Continue to keep her in the dark. Almost there. These words pierced me like a knife. I felt the ground slipping out from under my feet. This was not just cheating. It was a carefully planned conspiracy. All these little things that I had ignored for a long time now came together to form one big picture. Behind the outward well-being, there was a storm that had already begun to destroy our lives. But I could not give up. I decided that I would find a way to protect myself and my future. It was at that moment that I realized that my perfect life was just an illusion, and it was time to expose the truth. My story is not just a tale of betrayal. It is a story of how I, Vivienne, experienced an internal struggle that changed me forever. Every moment, every discovery left a deep mark on my soul, and I want to share these feelings so that you can understand what I had to go through. When I first heard that call in the middle of the night, my heart sank with fear. I woke up to the sound of his voice in the hallway. She still doesn't suspect a thing. Those words echoed in my mind, and I felt the cold penetrate every cell of my body. I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding. Who is he? Who is he talking to? What is he hiding? The questions kept coming, and I didn't know how to answer them. I felt betrayed, mixed with confusion. How could the man I'd lived with for 12 years lie to me so easily? The next morning, while looking through our accounts, I noticed suspicious transactions totaling about $50,000 over the past 6 months. Every number on the screen felt like a blow to my trust. I felt drained, as if someone was slowly sucking all the energy out of me. When I asked Adrian, he casually answered something about investments. His casualness in answering only increased my anxiety. I couldn't understand how he could lie so calmly when I felt so broken. And then there was more. He suddenly became interested in my personal finances, asking for a list of all my accounts and passwords in case of an emergency. Every question, every step he took seemed part of some grand plan that I couldn't decipher. I felt helpless. I, who had always been so confident, suddenly felt small and vulnerable. Every day brought new discoveries, and each one was like a punch to the gut. The moment he left his phone unattended, I saw a text from Lauren. Keep keeping her in the dark. Almost there. My world came crashing down. This wasn't just cheating. It was a carefully planned plot. I felt the ground shift from under my feet. A feeling of betrayal mixed with rage washed over me. How could he do this to me? How could he lie to me for so long? When Adrian asked me to sign the transfer of property, I knew it was time to act. I hired a private investigator, Evelyn Marsh, who helped me transfer all my assets into a trust fund before Adrian filed for divorce. That was the beginning of my fight for my life. I felt stronger with every step I took. I was no longer the woman who was afraid of the truth. I became someone who was ready to fight for my freedom. A real war began. Adrian tried to discredit my name by spreading rumors about financial fraud. Together with Evelyn, we collected irrefutable evidence of the falsification of documents that he presented ill to court. Each victory in this fight gave me strength. I felt my confidence growing with each passing day. I was no longer a victim. I had become a warrior, ready to fight for my life. The final battle took place in the courtroom. I, Vivienne, sat in the front row, feeling my pulse pounding in my ears. This was the defining moment, the culmination of all those months of struggle, fears, and discoveries. Adrian sat opposite, his face calm, but I saw how he nervously tapped his fingers on the table, a small weakness of his that I knew all too well. The trial began with Adrian's lawyer speaking. He stood up, straightened his tie, and confidently addressed the judge. "Your Honor, my client has every reason to believe that Mrs. Vivienne has illegally transferred marital assets in order to avoid an equitable division of property in the divorce. We request a full financial audit of all transactions over the past 6 months." I felt my heart clench. This was Adrian's last desperate move, his attempt to intimidate me and drag out the process. But this time, I was ready. My attorney, Evelyn Marsh, rose from her seat. She was calm, collected, and incredibly professional. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and confident, "all of my client's financial actions were made before Mr. Adrian filed for divorce. There is no evidence of malpractice or fraud." She placed a thick folder of documents on the judge's desk. "Furthermore, we seek immediate dismissal of this case with prejudice and reimbursement of all legal costs, as this is a clear attempt at financial pressure." The judge took the documents and began to study them carefully. The room was silent, broken only by the scratch of the judge's pen as he took notes. I could feel Adrian staring at me, waiting for me to show even the slightest sign of emotion. But I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. I sat up straight, keeping my expression impassive. After what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up. "The court finds no basis for a full financial examination. The case is dismissed. Additionally, due to lack of evidence, Mr. Adrian is ordered to pay all legal costs associated with this lawsuit." The slam of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. It was over. Adrian had lost. I saw his face go pale, his jaw clenched in an attempt to maintain composure. But inside, I knew he was seething with rage and humiliation. As we left the courtroom, Adrian walked past me without saying a word. But at the last moment, he whispered loud enough for me to hear, "You think this is the end? Just wait." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I knew it was the empty boast of a man who knew he'd lost. But I also knew Adrian wasn't one to give up easily. He could still make one last attempt. Sure enough, the next morning, Evelyn called me. "We have a problem," she said. "Adrian and Lauren have filed a formal complaint. They're accusing you of financial fraud. They say you've been falsifying financial records for months." I felt the air leave my lungs. If these charges were accepted, I could face real legal consequences. "Are the documents real?" I asked, trying to remain calm. "No," Evelyn replied. "They're counterfeit. Someone tried really hard to forge them, but they made a mistake. Beatrice checked the timestamps on the financial transactions. The accounts didn't even exist at the time the transactions were supposedly made." I took a deep breath. This was their mistake, and it would be their end. My fear gave way to cold determination. "I want to go on the offensive," I told Evelyn. "Not just clear my name, I want to destroy them." Evelyn nodded. "Okay, we have everything we need. We'll file a motion proving the documents are forgeries, and then we'll countersue Adrian and Lauren for defamation and tampering with legal evidence." 2 weeks later, I was back in court. This time, I watched Adrian closely as Evelyn presented our case. She spoke clearly and confidently. "These documents introduced as evidence against my client are forgeries. We have irrefutable evidence that the financial transactions in question never occurred." The forensic expert took the stand, explaining in detail every faked timestamp, every changed number. Adrian's lawyers were visibly nervous. They knew they were losing. Then came the final blow. Evelyn placed a new folder on the judge's desk. Your Honor, in light of these false allegations, my client is suing Mr. Adrian and his accomplice Lauren Silver for slander and tampering with legal evidence. The courtroom fell silent. Adrian's attorney quickly whispered something to his client.